This morning's Torah portion is called Tetzei, which is Hebrew for when you go up, and it's the first words in our parashah this morning, which is our 49th weekly Torah portion in our annual cycle of Torah readings, and it covers Deuteronomy 21 verse 10 through chapter 25 verse 19. The Torah portion focuses on all the laws that deal with honoring all life wherever you go, it says. 74 of the Torah's 613 commandments are in this parashah dealing with honoring others and all forms of life. And these include the laws of the beautiful captive, the inheritance rights of the firstborn, the wayward and rebellious son, burial and dignity of the dead, returning a lost object, sending away the mother bird before taking her young, the duty to erect a safety fence around a roof of one's home, and the various forms of kilayim, which is forbidden plant and animal hybrids. All of these are focusing on respecting life in different forms. And also recounted are the judicial procedures and penalties for adultery, for the rape or seduction of an unmarried girl, and for a husband who falsely accuses his wife of infidelity. Also, the following cannot marry a person of Jewish lineage: a mamzer, which is someone born from an adulterous or incestuous relationship, as well as a male of Moabite or Ammonite descent, a first or second generation Edomite, or an Egyptian. All of these are outlined as far as the laws of honoring the life in respect to the marriage and procreation for Jews. Our parashah also includes laws governing the purity of the military camp, the prohibition against turning in escaped slave, and the duty to pay a worker on time, and to allow anyone working for you, whether it's a man or an animal, to be able to eat on the job, which is respecting the life and work that they're doing. Also, the proper treatment of a debtor, and the prohibition against charging interest on a loan, the laws of divorce, from which also derive many laws of marriage, and the penalty of 39 lashes for transgressing a Torah prohibition, and the procedures for yibum, which is the Levirate marriage of the wife of a deceased childless brother, or a halitza, which means removing of the shoe, in the case that the brother-in-law does not wish to marry her, as we saw in the case of Ruth. Then, Tetzei concludes with the obligation to remember what Amalek did to you on the road on your way out of Egypt. And thus we see that this parashah contains more mitzvot commandments than any other portion. As mentioned, parashat Tetzei contains a total of 74 commandments of the 613 commandments. 27 are positive mitzvot, and 47 are prohibitions, all in regards to honoring life and preserving life by being proactive in preventing the loss of life or protecting life by all means necessary. So, as we like to do each week, I want to show you what the source of these mitzvot commandments are in their origin. And in chapter 21, verse 10 through the end of the chapter, we see that there are 6 mitzvot, starting in verse 11, which is about the law of a beautiful woman taken captive at war. And the second commandment in this parashah is in verse 14, not to sell a beautiful woman taken captive at war. Also, we are not to make a beautiful woman taken captive at war work as a slave after one has been conjugally intimate with her. And in verse 22, we get the mitzvah to hang a person after his execution when it is required. And the fifth mitzvah, in verse 23, is not to leave a person who was hung overnight on the gallows, and not to leave a dead man overnight in his house, unless it is for his honor. And then also we get the mitzvah to bury a person put to death by court sentence or any other deceased person the same day that he dies. Then in chapter 22, we see there are 21 commandments, and they are, in verse 1, to return lost property to its owner. In verse 3, not to turn a blind eye to a lost object. And in verse 4, not to leave a fellow man's animal lying under its burden. Also, we get from this verse the mitzvah to help lift up a heavy load. And in verse 5, we see that a woman should not wear men's clothing, and a man should not wear women's clothing. These are considered two separate mitzvots, even though they come from the same verse. And in verse 6, we get the mitzvah not to take the mother bird while its eggs or young are in the nest. In verse 7, we get the mitzvah to send away the mother bird from its nest when taking its eggs or young. And in verse 8, we get the mitzvah to build a parapet or a fence around a dangerous roof or pit, like a safety fence. And also not to leave a dangerous roof or pit without some form of protection. Then in verse 9, we get the mitzvah not to sow a mixture of seeds in a vineyard in the land of Israel, as well as not to eat the produce of mixed seeds grown in a vineyard in the land of Israel. In verse 10, we get the mitzvah not to work with two kinds of animals together, because it would be more burdensome for the weaker of the two. So we're showing respect for the life. And in verse 11, we get the mitzvah not to wear cloth of mixed wool and linen. Then in verse 13, we get the mitzvah of kiddushin, which is the betrothing of a woman. And in verse 19, a man who spreads an evil report that his wife was immoral is to remain with her permanently, we are told. As well as we get the mitzvah that a man who spreads an evil report that his wife was immoral may not divorce his wife. Then in verse 24, we get the mitzvah that the court should stone a person who is sentenced to stoning. And in verse 26, we get the mitzvah not to punish a person who was forced to transgress. In verse 29, we get the mitzvah that a rapist must marry his victim, and he may not divorce his victim. Two separate mitzvots in relation to when this would happen in ancient times. And that brings us to chapter 23, in which we see there are 20 mitzvot commandments. And starting in verse 2, we get the mitzvah that a sterilized man may not marry a Jewish girl. And in verse 3, that an illegitimate child from an adulterous or incestuous union should not marry a Jewish woman. In verse 4, we get the mitzvah that a person from the nations of Ammon or Moab may not marry a Jewish woman. And in verse 7, we get the mitzvah not to make peace with the nations of Ammon or Moab before a war. In verse 9 of chapter 23, we get the mitzvah that a descendant of Esau may not marry a Jewish person even after he has converted to Judaism, nor may his child. And in verse 8, we get the mitzvah that an Egyptian may not marry a Jewish person even after he was converted to Judaism. And just like the descendant of Esau, neither may his child marry a Jewish woman. In verse 11, we get the mitzvah that a ritually impure person may not enter the camp of the Levites, as the Levites always resided around the temple, and that would expose the temple to uncleanness. In verse 13, we see that we are to prepare a lavatory outside of the camp when at war. And in verse 14, we get the mitzvah to prepare a shovel for each person in the army so he can cover his excrement as well. So laws of cleanliness relate to laws of honoring life and those around us as well. In verse 16, we get the mitzvah not to return a slave who fled from his master in the Diaspora to the land of Israel. And verse 17, we get the mitzvah not to oppress a slave who flees from his master in the Diaspora to the land of Israel. And in verse 18, we get the mitzvah not to be intimate with a woman out of wedlock. And verse 19 gives us the mitzvah that we are not to bring the wage of a harlot or the exchange price of a dog as an offering in the temple. And then in verse 20, we get the mitzvah not to borrow at interest from a Jew. Verse 21 is the source for our mitzvah to charge a non-Jew interest, though, because it only mentions your fellow man not charging interest in relation to your fellow man in Israel at that time. In chapter 23, verse 22, we get the mitzvah not to delay a vow to make an offering or to delay the offering of a consecrated animal for 3 festivals. And then in verse 24, we get the mitzvah to fulfill one's vows and oaths. In verse 25, we get the mitzvah to permit a hired worker to eat certain types of produce while he is under hire, as well as a hired worker should not take more produce from his employer than what he is allowed just for his own consumption. And then the final mitzvah in chapter 23 is found in verse 26. In regards to a hired worker should not eat from his employer's crops during his actual work. And that brings us to chapter 24, in which there are 15 commandments, and outlining them in verse 1, we see that one who wishes to divorce his wife must do so with a proper get, which is a bill of divorce. And a divorced man may not take back his ex-wife after she is married and divorced again or widowed, according to verse 4. In verse 5, we get the mitzvah that a bridegroom may not part from his wife during the first year of marriage. And a second mitzvah is derived from this, that a bridegroom must remain with his wife during the first year of marriage. In verse 6, we get the mitzvah not to pawn any objects with which sustaining food is prepared. And in verse 8, we get the mitzvah not to pluck out signs of zara'at. In verse 10, we get the mitzvah not to take an object and pledge from a debtor by force. And in verse 12, we get the mitzvah not to withhold a pledged object from its owner when he needs it. In verse 13, we get the mitzvah to return a pledged object to its owner when he needs it. And in verse 15, we get the mitzvah to pay the earnings of a hired worker on the day that he earned them. And in verse 16, we get the mitzvah that a person may not give testimony of a close relative at trial. And verse 17, we get the mitzvah not to pervert justice in the case of a convert or an orphan, as well as not to take anything in pledge from a widow. And in verse 19, we get the mitzvah to leave forgotten sheaves for the poor in the field, as well as to not take a forgotten sheaf of grain or forgotten fruit. And then finally, in chapter 25, in the first 19 verses, we see there's 12 commandments, and they are, starting in verse 2, to administer lashes to a person who transgresses certain prohibitions, and in verse 3, not to give additional lashes or hit any Jew. In verse 4, not to muzzle a domestic animal during its work. And in verse 5, we get the mitzvah, a childless widow should not marry any person other than her late husband's brother. As well as a childless widow should marry her late husband's brother, which is a part of the Levirate marriage laws. Then in verse 9, we get the mitzvah of halatzah, which is releasing a woman from the obligation of a Levirate marriage. And then in verse 12, we get the mitzvah to save a person pursued by a killer by attacking the killer, as well as not to have mercy on a pursuing killer. So in order to preserve life, we see here that those that seek to take it, we are allowed to protect ourselves or protect others from those pursuing killers. In verse 13, we get the mitzvah not to keep inaccurate scales or weights, even if they are not used. And then, in closing, we have in verse 17 and 19, 3 final mitzvah to remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people when they came out of Egypt is actually a commandment. Because we are told that the spirit of Amalek will arise in every generation to wipe out the Jewish people. So in order to preserve life or honor life, we are commanded to remember what Amalek did and to be aware that that spirit will arise in every generation. And in verse 19, it goes as far as to say to eradicate the descendants of Amalek, because they're going to constantly be seeking the death of God's people. And finally, the 74th mitzvot in this passage is not to forget what Amalek did to the Jewish people when they came out of Egypt. So, of all these commandments, one stands out, especially in chapter 22, which says, "If walking along the road you chance upon a bird's nest, and the mother is sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young. Let the mother go and take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life." That's in verse 6 of chapter 22. And the Talmud labels this mitzvah the lightest, meaning the most insubstantial of all the commandments, probably because it takes little effort to perform. Sending away the mother might well involve merely making a loud noise. Indeed, just walking close or advancing might induce the mother to fly away. Commentators in every generation have wondered why there is so extravagant a reward, a good and long life, for such a trivial act. Indeed, it should be noted that the same reward is specified in the Torah for honoring parents. Remember in the 5th commandment, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God is giving thee. Yet fulfilling that commandment takes a lifetime and often involves money and emotion and effort without limit. The commonality, though, between the two mitzvot is honor for the source of life, as it is our highest duty to seek to ever connect on a deeper level with the source of all life. It is also realized that the equality of reward is the same, no matter how great or small the mitzvah to honor the source of life in all things. The lightest of commandments is rewarded as much as the weightiest, to teach us to treasure and observe all commandments equally, for the cause and effect reward of any mitzvah is often unseen and yet of immense importance. Now, a little Devar Torah meditation about the name of our parashah, Tetzei, in regards to all the laws that deal with honoring life wherever you go, as it says. And there is more to understand, as Tetzei is specifically used in the context of when you go out to war. Although the ideal of peace is so prominent in regard to honoring life in the Torah, God also designed and created the world in such a way that it leaves man subject to an almost constant inner strife, having to wage relentless battle with our evil inclination called Yetzer Hara in Hebrew. In this battle with the selfish ego of the Yetzer Hara, we need to be strengthened by the word of Yah as the sword of the Spirit in our spiritual warfare. And in fact, the Zohar points out that the Hebrew word for bread, which is lechem, is derived from the same root that denotes war. In our opening passage, Tetzei, when you go out to war, the word for war here in Hebrew is milchama, with the lamed chet and mem of bread at its center of lechem, hinting at the fact that eating the right spiritual bread will be the secret to our success in our spiritual war with the lower selfish nature. This word for war, coming from lacham, in the sense of fighting a battle and being engaged in the spiritual warfare with the ego, is used here as well as in Exodus 15 verse 3, where it says that Adonai is an ish of war. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is his name. This symbolizes the concept of the Spirit's continuous struggle between the base and sublime nature of man. For instance, whether he eats his bread as a glutton in the manner that an animal eats its food, or on a higher level, to keep the body healthy in order to be able to do what is good and right in accordance with the will of the Creator. This is why we must ever focus on living according to the spiritual bread more than the physical. And this is why fasting from physical food regularly is so beneficial to connecting us to the divine source and for our spiritual growth. One source of inspiration to help a person succeed in overcoming these challenges is to reflect upon the source of his soul. Our sages taught that Jewish souls actually preceded the rest of creation. In Bereshit Rabbah 1:4, and we were even consulted by God when the decision was being made whether or not to create the world, and the souls gave their full consent. Thus, from the elevated vantage point of the soul in its primary source, every aspect of this world was seen as conducive to serving God, for otherwise the soul would not have consented to its creation. At that moment, the soul appreciated how things that we perceive now as a negative influence or a seeming enemy, because they attempt to detour us from observing God's will, are in truth an aid to divine service, for they enable us to serve God out of our own free choice, rather than as mere robots. Therefore, even the creation of our enemies had the soul's full consent. A soul, we are told, never forgets, even after it comes down into a body, facing the ongoing struggle between the base and the sublime. The soul retains an unbreakable inner strength and impervious to anything that may detour it from its mission. And this is the message of our parashah. If you go out, Tetzei, to war, when the soul goes out of its heavenly setting into a body to fight this spiritual war between the material and the spiritual, it never loses sight of the fact that every obstacle is surmountable and overcomable. This is why we are told, "Blessed is he who will gain the victory. I will give the right to eat of the tree of life." Through meditating upon this point, we can always be victorious upon our enemies. In other words, we can transcend every material and spiritual adversary, and sanctifying this physical world with goodness and spirituality, and honoring all life by connecting to the source of life wherever we go. Amen. Revelation 21:7 also says, "All who are victorious will inherit all of these blessings, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." May we all gain the victory and be known as the children of God. So now I open it up to you for questions and comments and to midrash about this parashah, teaching us deeper things about how we are to go out to war in the spiritual realm against the flesh and the adversary within.